Okay, hello, welcome. I've got a very limited role tonight. I'm David Forgach. I'm currently chair of the Department of Italian Studies, and I'm just going to introduce our temporary colleague here, visiting Professor Vincenzo Binetti, who's here sadly for just one semester, but he's had this wonderful initiative inviting Michael Hardt to come and speak to us. And I think I'll just let Vincenzo introduce Michael, and then we'll get on with the talk, which sounds very exciting. The only thing I'd say about that is I'm of that generation where I was around in Italy in the 1970s, and it was a heady time. And I'm very interested in this proposal that Michael's making to connect what was happening then with what might be happening now in other parts of the world. So, Vincenzo, if you'd like to take it from there.
So, good evening, everybody. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Michael Hardt, who is currently Professor of Literature and Italian Studies at the Duke University. He has written, as many of you already know, several books which have been translated in over 30 languages. His writings investigate the political, legal, economic, and social aspect of globalization and the new forms of domination in the contemporary world, as well as the social movement and other forces of liberation and antagonism that resist them. They also explore the political and economic alternatives that could lead to a more democratic world. Among Michael's very substantial list of publications, I would like to just mention his work in collaboration with Antonio Negri, Assembly with Oxford University Press in 2017, Declaration with Argon Avis in 2012, Commonwealth with Harvard University Press in 2009, Multitude with Penguin in 2004, Empire, again with the Harvard University Press in 2000. Michael's lecture tonight is part of a larger project and of a new book that is forthcoming in 2023 with Oxford University Press entitled The Subversive 70s, where he argues, among other things, for the relevance and importance of the progressive and revolutionary movements of the 70s in various parts of the world for our current political situation. I would like to say that, of course, this brief introduction was meant to offer you just a glimpse of the breadth of the work that Michael has produced so far, not only in terms of his historical, political, and philosophical thought, but also in terms of the importance of the struggles that have been carried on in our current times. I know that Michael doesn't like long introductions, so I'll stop here. The title of his lecture tonight is Laboratory Italy, Revolution and Civil War in Italy in the 1970s. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hardt to the Casa Italiana.
Yeah, thanks, Vincenzo, to the Italian department, to the Casa Italiana for having me. As Vincenzo said, I've recently finished this book about the progressive and revolutionary movements of the 1970s in various countries, and what I prepared for today is a part of it that has to do with Italy. I should say first that I essentially wasn't there for the 1970s. I mean, I was alive. I was in middle school. And there were many people in middle school who were politically involved, and I wasn't. I was in the U.S. I'm a U.S.er from that. And I know that some of you probably lived some of these events in first person, as one would say. But and so you might know better than I. But before beginning, I want to explain three basic hypotheses that guided my research in order to contextualize the talk. The first is that I find the revolutionary movements of the 1970s are more significant for us today than those of the 1960s. I mean, the 60s were, of course, important and transformative, but in my view, the 60s essentially belonged to the past, whereas the 70s were the beginning of our era. Not so much because neoliberalism began there, but rather because the political problems identified then are still our own. And I'll come back to that a little bit more later, and maybe even that'll become clear during the talk. The second basic hypothesis or guiding idea is that social movements produce concepts, especially revolutionary movements. And what I mean by this in part is that there's no strict division between no strict division of labor between intellectuals who think and activists who act. But rather, that movements themselves or activists themselves produce concepts. Some of the concepts I trace throughout the book, and in Italy, some is one of the places where they're maybe most apparent, and you'll be able to see here 4 concepts at least: autonomy, multiplicity, democracy, and liberation. I sort of use the concepts in a way to mark the continuity among these struggles in different parts of the world, which sometimes didn't communicate with each other. In Guinea-Bissau, the gay liberation movements in the US and Britain, France, the revolutions in Iran, Nicaragua, Portugal, Chile, industrial workers' movements in Italy, which I'll talk about some now, in the US and France, et cetera. One of the other problems I've had with the book, and in Italy this is the most apparent maybe, and I thought I should mention this beforehand, is that I find that the violence and repression and armed struggle are sometimes the most enduring images of the 1970s, and even at the time were the most spectacular elements. And they tend to eclipse, it seems to me, what was most interesting political at the time. So in the book, I try to, in some ways, quarantine this discussion about armed struggle toward the end, and I'm going to do somewhat the same today. In fact, I'm not going to talk today about the clandestine left armed struggle groups. I won't talk about the Red Brigades and the Aldo Moro affair. I mean, I'm happy to, at the end, if you're interested, to give you my both assessment of what was going on in the clandestine armed struggles and my own critique of them. But like I said, I'm not going to talk about them, at least directly to start. And I hope that's not, well, actually, I hope that's disorienting. But I was going to say, I hope that's not dissatisfying. But I hope, in any case, what I've got prepared, you know, I gave as a title, something like, as a subtitle, Revolution and Civil War in Italy. What I've got is about, I think, 30 or 40 minutes about revolution. And then I'm going to try to look at you and gauge if I should keep going on and talk about the part about Civil War. If it seems like we've gone too long, then I could stop there and see if that's enough. Okay, so first the part about revolution, as I see it. Well, okay, I'll just go on. Italian revolutionary movements in the 70s were remarkable for being able to theorize how capitalist relations of production were being transformed and new mechanisms of control deployed, grasping changes in real time as they occurred. Think of them as canaries in the gold mine. In the coal mine, I mean, gold, okay, that registered early what others too would suffer. But really that image is too passive. Better to consider them as so many scientists in a new laboratory, experimenting with mixtures of previously unknown substances, which sometimes blew up in their faces, but also occasionally give glimpses of a new possible alchemy. What matters most to me is that they were able not only to understand how the structures of domination were changing, but also to invent concepts and forms of political organization able to engage with and contest that new world. So what I've presented here is a drama in 3 acts. In the first, between the late 60s and early 70s, Italian industrial workers became the primary protagonists of revolutionary struggle. As in North America, Latin America, and other countries in Western Europe, the revolutionary force was not the official workers' movement, with its established parties and unions. In these years, although the Italian Communist Party consistently gained votes and developed a project for entry into the government coalition, the most innovative and combative worker activity took place in movements outside of the Communist Party and its affiliated unions to their left, and often in explicit conflict with them. In the United States and other countries, too, the other workers' movement, other to the traditional and established one, in which workers organized autonomously to attack factory discipline and capitalist domination, arrived at a point of making industrial and social relations virtually ungovernable. The second act, situated around 1973, was the pivot. Economic and political elites in the dominant countries, frightened by workers' insurgencies and various orders of crisis, set in motion various processes to reduce the role of industrial labor and commodity manufacturing, using techniques such as automation, transferring factories to subordinated countries, which eventually together served to reorient the domestic economies toward the production of immaterial goods, services, and finance. The Italian anomaly begins to appear in this act, since many of the Italian radical left were able to theorize more swiftly and more clearly than others the nature and political consequences of this process. They understood that revolutionary struggle could no longer center on industrial workers, their interests and needs, and they recognized that this did not mean the end of class struggle, but rather entry into a new phase of it. In a third act, then, this is still all sort of a preface, a summary. In the third act, then, the most important one, Italian activists, on the basis of their theorizations of the new terrain of political conflict, began to imagine and construct new revolutionary constellations that included, but were no longer centered on industrial workers. They experimented with the means to link together a multiplicity of struggles, including feminists, students, industrial and public sector workers, unemployed and precarious workers, gay liberation movements, and others, each of which strove for liberation on its own terms in ways that sometimes conflicted with the others. To realize this would require devising adequate organizational structures that could articulate diverse movements without reducing the relative autonomy of any one of them. Focusing on the transformation in Italy among these three acts helps illustrate one of the overall arguments in the book of mine, which is this: whereas the power structures, political formations, and paradigms of struggles in the 1960s, which constituted a culmination of a long process across the mid-20th century, belong to an earlier phase, those of the 70s challenge and explore the fundamental conditions that still define our political reality today. Even though adequate analyses of the new structures of power and new organizational forms were not fully elaborated in Italy in the 70s, the movements did identify and confront key political problems which we face today, in particular those posed for revolutionary movements by the changing nature of capitalist relations and the problem of multiplicity within the movements themselves. The Italian movements of the 70s were not able adequately to solve these problems. An articulated, organized constellation of multiple movements appeared on the horizon as a goal in this period, but it was only partly realized before the extreme repression of the late 1970s swept away the movement's gains. Their theoretical and practical experiments nonetheless chart paths that remain open to us today. To highlight and investigate this transformation will require not only reconstructing the general course of events and the primary actors, but also following the developments of concepts that served as guideposts for movements, practices, and theorizations. This conceptual approach is particularly appropriate for the Italian case, it seems to me, not only because the discussions among activists in the revolutionary movements of the 70s were conducted in intellectually rich technical vocabularies, but also because the movements gave rise to an extraordinary set of political thinkers who have since been widely recognized internationally. In each act, then, I'll emphasize concepts that give special insight into the political projects, and in addition, I devote special attention to how the meanings of key terms shifted over the course of these developments in line with the overall movements of the drama. Okay, so first act, about organizing workers' autonomy. Between the late 60s and early 70s, Italian revolutionary movements centered on industrial workers. As I said, they achieved an extraordinarily high level of intensity that threatened both the capitalist class and the national political order. By the time of Italy's so-called hot summer of 1969, worker rebellions had reached maturity, and together they demonstrated the potential for several new conditions of struggle. First, the emergence of the mass industrial workers as primary protagonists of revolutionary struggle. Second, the autonomy of a large segment of workers from the unions and the traditional parties. And third, the capacity of this autonomous worker struggle to spill out of the factory into the city, and thus to serve as a base and focal point for a general social rebellion. One conflict at Fiat's enormous Mirafiori auto plant in Turin in July 1969, which initiated the hot autumn, was read by militants throughout the country as a signal that a new phase of political struggle had arrived. In the early months of 1969, Fiat workers had gone out on strike several times, and moreover continually demonstrated their autonomy for the unions, even if only in very small ways. In May of '69, for instance, Fiat workers participated in a union-led strike, but then extended it by an hour and added their own demands to the unions list. In response, the unions, recognizing they were losing control of worker activism, called a general strike, demanding a resolution to workers' housing problems, a theme they thought would gain back support from the workers. The union strategy, however, didn't work. The self-organized student worker assembly at the Fiat auto plant decided to take advantage of the union-led strike inside the factory to launch their own demands outside in the streets. As soon as the march moved outside the factory gates, over 3,000 workers plus many people from the neighborhood, the police attacked, preventing them from going to the city center and forcing them onto Corso Traiano, a wide avenue near the entrance to the plant. Police wielded billy clubs and rifle butts and shot tear gas. Demonstrators built barricades and threw rocks. The battle continued for hours, and by the end of the night, hundreds had been injured and arrested. There I go. The battle on Corso Traiano highlighted all three conditions of the new workers' struggle I cited a minute ago. The workers acted autonomously from the unions and parties that claimed to represent their interests. They attacked factory discipline and ownership, and moreover, their struggle came out of the factory into the city, suggesting that the struggle and the industrial workers themselves could play a central role in a general social rebellion. In fact, I know some of you have just read Balestrini's Vogliamo Tutto, which is an excellent historical account even of the Corso Traiano battle that I just talked of. Two revolutionary parties created in the late 1960s, Potere Operaio, Workers' Power, and Lotta Continua, continuous struggle, or the struggle goes on, were both aimed to organize worker insurgency in this new phase of struggle. They were both present to varying degrees in the major cities and the major factories throughout the country. Both had leadership structures composed primarily of intellectuals, and both published newspapers that, in addition to reporting on events, created a political line and a common vocabulary. Significant differences between them, there were significant differences between them, and they often competed with each other. But most important for my argument is that they were equally dedicated to the central position of the industrial working class in revolutionary struggle. High school students, university students, and professors, along with a wide range of other activists, played important roles in these parties. But they did so by going under the slogan, "Going to the factory," in such a way that the industrial workers remained the focal point. Indeed, the political program of industrial workers dominated the political imaginary of the entire radical left in these years. And these parties were a result and expression of that centrality. I should emphasize that even though the factory remained the center of gravity, the belief that industrial workers could also come out of the factory and lead a social rebellion was essential to the politics of these two parties and the radical left in general. That's why the image of the workers, together with people from the neighborhood battling police in Corso Traiano, quickly became iconic. Lotta Continua, one of the parties I just mentioned, launched the slogan, "Let's take the city," prendiamoci la città, which served as a guiding idea for militants inside and outside the party for the next several years. The primary idea was to extend attention from the factory to society, and from the limited conception of the working class to a broader notion of the proletariat, conceived as all of those who were oppressed by capital, thus focusing on housing, transportation, schools, and so forth. Struggle on the social terrain, explains Luigi Bobbio, who was a member of Lotta Continua in these years. He says, struggle on the social terrain was seen as an element that gave more power to the factory struggle, insofar as it permitted workers' autonomy to invest at once all aspects of capitalist domination. In the early 70s, then, even such expansive conceptions of social struggle were still anchored in worker centrality as an axiom of political organization. I wanted to pause at this point for a first theoretical investigation, or reflection, really. Two concepts that characterize the political developments of this first act that served as guiding principles among radical workers and far-left political groups from the early 60s onwards were the refusal of work, il rifiuto del lavoro, and workers' autonomy, autonomia operaia. Like many other concepts that emerge in the context of political struggle, these were not ascribed to any one thinker, but developed collectively and were thus given a range of meanings that evolved over time. In fact, I'll try to explain shortly that the shifting meanings of these concepts across the 1970s corresponded to the changing political needs of the movements. At base, or really as background to the concept, the refusal of work names the primary weapon that workers wield against capital. The strike is the ultimate refusal, but there are also a wide variety of micro-refusals, including slowdowns, work sabotage, absenteeism, and the like. When they refuse work, workers are not refusing productivity or creativity per se. Rather, they're refusing the command, discipline, and work conditions imposed on them by capital. The refusal of work should also be understood against the background of the state socialist orthodoxy that celebrates workers and work. Whereas the orthodoxy glorified work and preached a liberation of work, these workers proposed instead a liberation from work. The second concept, workers' autonomy, is in many respects an allied concept to the refusal of work. It can be situated first in relation to the Italian trade union movement's claims in these same years to autonomy from the political parties, and thus maintaining that the unions were free to bargain with management and declare strikes on their own accord. Workers' autonomy, then, takes a further step, independent of not only the political parties, but also the official unions. Some of the political consequences of workers' autonomy are immediately evident. Workers themselves, not their appointed union or party representatives, must have the power to make political decisions and take action of their own accord. The self-organization of struggles, which was key to worker autonomy, was manifest in the increasing use of wildcat strikes, a paradigmatic instrument of workers' independence, and in the propensity of workers to turn against unions when the unions brokered deals that conceded to management demands. The script of striking workers battling not only management and the police, but also the unions, was repeated continually in Italy and in other countries, the US in particular, throughout this period. Calls for workers' autonomy were often addressed by creating institutions of democratic self-governance. Here's Andre Gortz writing about Italy. He's doing this from France. In 1972, Gortz wrote, "At Fiat, for example, the workers' struggle against the capitalist work organization has produced autonomous workers' demands and organizational forms, assembly line and shop committees, revocable by the base, self-limitation of work pace, and so on. In such situations," this is still Gortz writing, "in such situations, owners have not only made no democratic concessions, but have done everything possible to smash workers' autonomy and resistance and to prohibit organs of direct democracy in the factories, assemblies, committees, councils, and reestablish the power of trade union regimentation based on indirect representation." That was all Andre Gortz. So Gortz formulates an equation that puts all the elements together, it seems to me. The refusal of work, he said, the workers' struggle against the capitalist work organization, plus workers' autonomy from trade union claims based on indirect representation, is what Gortz said. Those together equal a democratic political project of a new type, embodied in participatory assemblies, committees, and councils. So that was all this first phase I'm talking about, first act, from the late 60s to the early 1970s. The second act involves the end of the centrality of the industrial worker. It might seem ironic that just after Italian industrial workers had so fiercely demonstrated their power in the late 60s and early 70s, just as they had reached the point of threatening the national capitalist order, the rug pulled out from under them. Workers' struggles had made the country's productive system so ungovernable that the ruling political and economic powers were forced to dismantle the existing productive and social relations in order to undermine workers' power. Factory labor was progressively displaced from the privileged position in national capitalist production, principally through automation and outsourcing, and correspondingly, the factory worker tended to be ousted from a hegemonic position in class struggle. Another conflict at Fiat's Mirafiori plant, this one in March 1973, so now 4 years after the previous one I talked about, illustrates how the political terrain had shifted. Fiat management, citing the economic recession, had begun a process of restructuring to include layoffs and automation. Workers responded with an 8-hour strike, an internal demonstration in which 10,000 workers marched through the various workshops of the plant, this enormous Fiat plant in Turin, blocking all the entrances and exits and effectively stopping all production. The next day, when workers at Mirafiori, the auto plant, decided to occupy the plant and then held it with arms for 3 days, all the other sections of Fiat in Turin, of the auto industry really, followed suit. The strike ended in victory in the sense that management granted extra vacation and equal pay raises for all workers, but in the following months and years, the restructuring continued and intensified, and what may have seemed like a victory at first began to look more like a defeat. One might think that with such a massive show of force, occupying several plants for 3 days, the workers were more powerful than ever. But this event was interpreted by many in the revolutionary movement instead as a symptom of weakness. Antonio Negri, for instance, just after the strike, criticized the Fiat workers for having adopted a merely defensive program, concentrating exclusively on resisting capitalist restructuring. Moreover, he lamented they had isolated themselves. Why didn't the Fiat workers, he asked, go out of the occupied factory? The hope generated in 1969 that worker struggle could lead a wider social rebellion when Fiat workers battled the police in the streets together with others from the neighborhood now evaporated. With workers closed in the plant, they had become merely what they called at the time the party of Mirafiori, like closed onto themselves, really, representing only themselves, yeah. The 1973 Fiat strike thus signaled the end of the centrality of the industrial worker, and specifically the end of the promise that the workers' struggle could lead a broad social insurrection. This brings me to another theoretical reflection. The end of the centrality of industrial workers was interpreted by a conceptual shift between two terms. The first is the factory society, and the second is the social factory. These are terms that were actually used by many people in different ways, and I'm giving them a uniform meaning to make my point better. In the early 1960s, Mario Tronti called the factory society, he described the factory society as the entire proletarian world that surrounds and emanates from the factory. Here's Tronti saying this. He says, at the highest level of capitalist development, this social relation becomes a moment of the relation of production. The whole of society becomes an articulation of production. The whole society lives in function of the factory, and the factory extends its exclusive dominion over the whole society. The term factory society, on the one hand, registers that capital requires various forms of social cooperation and reproduction. Tronti said the whole of society becomes an articulation of production. And on the other hand, it maintains the factory's centrality to an exclusive dominion over, as Tronti says, all of social production. The factory society is thus a concept that belongs to the first period that I was talking about, illustrated, for example, by the Fiat workers spilling out of the factory in 1969 on Corso Traiano to lead a wider social struggle, but one that always stems from and finds its rationality back in the factory and the leadership of industrial workers. Instead, the social factory, so instead of the factory society, the social factory is a concept that moves between the later 1970s through what I'm calling Act 2 and Act 3. It no longer posits the centrality of industry in capitalist production and the industrial worker and proletarian organization. Instead, it casts society as a whole as a kind of factory, that is, as a site of not only capitalist production, but also, as feminist theorists highlight, social reproduction. Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, for instance, conceives of the social factory, this is her writing, the social factory as organization of the reproduction of labor power, thinking specifically of unpaid women's work in the home. The feminist analysis of social factory demonstrates, as Kathy Weeks explains, that, and here's a quote from Weeks, the time of production continues well beyond the formal working day. The space of production reaches beyond the discrete workplace, and the relations of production extend beyond the specific employment relation. So whereas the factory society maintains the centrality of factory as a site of production and the industrial worker as protagonists of struggle, the social factory decentralizes these figures, opening to a wide multiplicity of forms of social production and reproduction, and thus also necessarily an equally wide plurality of protagonists of struggle. This conceptual development corresponds to organizational tensions and eventually crises within the two parties I mentioned earlier, Potere Operaio and Lotta Continua. One should keep in mind, of course, that despite these tensions, for many activists, especially young people, the opportunity to participate in workers' struggle through these parties was extraordinarily productive and in many cases life-changing. Membership in the party offered an intense training in political militancy, which many activists subsequently translated into other social struggles. The two parties in particular functioned as incubators for a generation of intellectuals and activists on the left. That said, however, internal challenges emerged increasingly forcefully in the early 1970s. Strongly contested in particular, especially by feminists, was the assumption, shared by both parties to some extent, that the industrial worker, almost exclusively male, occupied the central position as the protagonist of struggle and subject to be liberated. One emblematic example, Maria Rosa dalla Costa, who I mentioned just a minute ago, who was a member of Potere Operaio, after dissatisfaction with its male-centered politics, left the party in June 1971 and helped found a feminist organization, and the following year published a book, Potere Femminile e Sovversione Sociale, which in English is translated as Women and the Subversion of Community, signaling with the title shift from workers' power to women's power, a different protagonist of revolutionary struggle. Dalla Costa provides only one example of a variety of feminist currents that contested the orientation of these parties. Tensions created by gender politics led to crises in both Potere Operaio and Lotta Continua, and indeed the dissolution of Lotta Continua after its October 1976 party conference was explicitly due to a rebellion of the, quote, women's section. And feminists were only one of many currents that contested the axiom of industrial worker centrality. The vanguard function of these parties, and more generally their formal and informal hierarchies, was another source of tension, one closely related to the first, insofar as the leadership of the parties was primarily male and oriented towards industrial worker struggles. Both Lotta Continua and Potere Operaio prided themselves on being born from and remaining close to the movements, but in the course of the 70s, this vanguard function was increasingly out of step with the movements. Nanni Balestrini and Primo Moroni interpret the March 1973 Fiat strike that I mentioned before, where they didn't exit the factory. They interpreted that as a symptom of this fact. So here's the Balestrini and Moroni writing. They say the Mirafiori occupation in 1973 determined the collapse of the role played by the revolutionary groups, eliminating their vanguardist function. Indeed, the vanguardist function was one of the central issues that resulted in the dissolution of Potere Operaio at its 1973 convention. So the great capitalist crisis and restructuring in the 70s, along with the end of the centrality of the industrial worker, were not interpreted by these groups as the end of the class struggle or of the workers' movement, but rather as a transition from revolutionary working class politics, dictated in part by the new composition of labor itself. As Sandro Mezzadra explains, these theorists and activists, this is him writing here, he says, they understood perfectly the meaning of the end of the centrality of the factory, and they tried to invest the force accumulated by the workers' struggle on the social terrain in which production was being organized. The legacies of revolutionary class struggle and their powers were to be redirected in line with the new class composition, but the shift had to go further than that. The movement had to not only theorize the transformations of capital in the working class, but also to recognize other structures of domination and articulate with different protagonists of struggle, including feminists, unemployed youth, precarious workers, gay and lesbian activists, and others. It would take time, however, for this challenge to be fully registered, let alone successfully addressed. Now, for the third act, it's convenient to lead with the theoretical reflection and then proceed to the practical and organizational developments. In particular, the ways in which the concepts of autonomy and the refusal of work changed with respect to when I first brought them up a minute ago, allows us to measure the effects of this end of the centrality of the factory and to glimpse the contours of a new political agenda. Regarding the concept of workers' autonomy, so I'm going to do those two concepts again, workers' autonomy and then the refusal of work. Regarding the concept of workers' autonomy, the demand for the independence of workers from the dictation of parties and unions, as well as the affirmation of workers' self-organization, didn't decline, but in line with the notion of the social factory, analogous demands were added regarding new subjects and new social spaces. No longer was autonomy linked directly to direct interactions with management, the decisions to strike, or even life in the factory as a whole. In the mid-1970s, here's Balestrini and Moroni explaining this again, they say in the mid-1970s, the expression workers' autonomy came to mean that workers' very existence, the community of proletarian solidarity, could organize the social conditions of exchange, production, and cohabitation independently from bourgeois legality. Autonomy, from the law of exchange, from the law of selling one's time, from the law of private property. This expansion of the concept clearly strains against the worker designation, and indeed the term workers' autonomy was increasingly in this period trimmed simply to autonomy. The journal Rosso, for instance, writing in 1973, claimed that a new way of doing politics would have to be based on different autonomies, including, they wrote, autonomous movements of young people with marginalized social strata repressed and exploited by capital. The editors of Rosso, this journal, thus proposed a coordinated revolt of all those who are able to support the growth of workers' autonomy without renouncing their own autonomy and their own practices regarding their own specific needs. Still them writing. The Gruppo Gramsci is the group that was behind this journal, Rosso. The new project now became then not only to make all aspects of proletarian life, including the varied forms of social production and reproduction, autonomous from capitalist control, but also to organize a constellation of different autonomies as a coherent political project. Like workers' autonomy, the concept of the refusal to work was revised and expanded in the mid-1970s in light of the shift away from the centrality of the factory. One step in this process was the expansion of the terrain and objects of refusal beyond the workplace to include varied relations of the capitalist social order. Antonio Negri at the time wrote, the theme of the refusal of work was and still remains a terrific lever because it brings with it a wide set of demands from the reduction of work time to the theme of a social or political wage up to the entire restructuring of the social working day and the politics of public spending. The refusal of work then became a tactic not only for wage workers, but for everyone faced with the structures of capitalist domination. The feminist deployment of the concept, the refusal of work, accomplished the second step by emphasizing that the refusal of work can also be deployed as a tactic against patriarchal domination. Again, Maria Rosa della Costa revised and reoriented the traditional concept, insisting that women, even women engaged in unpaid domestic labor in the home, must refuse the myth of liberation, this is Della Costa writing, through work. They must refuse the myth of liberation through work. And indeed, she continued, this is exemplified in the rejection by millions of women of women's traditional place. The refusal of work thus took on a more directly social character, and varied political practices of refusal became second nature to young activists in the 1970s. Again, Balestrini and Moroni writing here, they say, the concept of the refusal of work, which had cut across the 1960s and the first half of the 70s, now finally found its most effective generation, one that made this concept the central element of their cultural, social, and political identity. So just as workers' autonomy was transformed into a set of autonomies, so too the workers' tactic of the refusal of work multiplied and gave rise to practices of refusal against multiple structures of domination. These theoretical and practical political innovations, of course, required a new form of political organization. Soon after the dissolution of Potere Operaio in 1973, many of the former activists formed a new organization, Autonomia, composed of a broad network of local committees and collectives throughout the country, both in metropolitan centers and provincial towns. Patrick Cunningham, this is an author writing about the group, is right to emphasize that in contrast to Potere Operaio or Lotta Continua, Autonomia was not a political organization or a party, but a broad heterogeneous social movement made up of differing and sometimes mutually antagonistic internal tendencies with marked local and regional differences. The negative mandate for the organizational form of Autonomia was clear. It had to break from both the tradition of the centralized vanguard party and the axiom of the centrality of industrial worker. The positive mandate was also clear, albeit abstract. Autonomia needed to create a plural form of political organization that afforded autonomy to a wide multiplicity of participating groups and collectives, while providing them the means to articulate their struggles together effectively. Only a diffuse networks of power, wrote Tony Negri at the time, can organize revolutionary democracy, do a widespread network of powers. Yeah, I'd say something like that. Anyway, this aspiration to democracy in the organizational experiments of Autonomia highlighted not only the independence from capitalist command and discipline, but also the at least relative autonomy of the various elements or sectors of the movement from each other in the network. The key feature of autonomia and the prime organizational challenge it faced was thus its internal multiplicity. The area of autonomia, as it was often called to emphasize its heterogeneity, calling it an area rather than really even a party, designated then a constellation of collectives and groups loosely held together. The multiplicity of this constellation operated along at least two axes. First were their heterogeneous forms of labor. Once the figure of the industrial worker was no longer deemed central, diverse figures of labor, most of which had long existed, came into full view. Service workers, care workers, unpaid domestic labor, precarious and informal, legal and illegal forms of work, and so forth. Together, of course, with workers in large and small industrial settings. Every regional collective that was part of autonomy, explains Lucio Castellano, traced the concrete particularity of class composition in that area without experiencing this as a limitation, but rather its reason for being. Second, the second axis of the organizational mandate of autonomia are the diverse structures of domination along with the distinct struggles for liberation. The new proletarian strata, youth and students, the unemployed, feminists, gay liberation activists, and more. Autonomia constituted a vast area like a galaxy, maintained, in which one can recognize some constellations, some smaller formations of diverse political histories, different cultural forms, different imaginations, each also with its own newspapers, communication networks, and meeting places. So the internal multiplicity of the constellation of elements in autonomia corresponded to its fluid external borders. The developments, the designation of autonomia as an area also indicated that its influence, especially its theoretical developments, extended far beyond its organizational boundaries. The portability of theoretical proposals and frameworks that emerged from autonomia both increased the range of its influence and blurred the boundaries between what was inside and outside its area. One widespread practice that constituted the area of autonomy in this period was the construction of proletarian youth centers, which consisted of autonomous, self-managed social spaces that often included free radio stations, canteens, headquarters for different political groups, and concert spaces. Young people, many without the possibility of finding housing outside their parents' home, created these centers often by occupying vacant public or private buildings illegally, with some similarities to squatters' movements in other European countries. Nanni Balestrini provides in his signature style of fluid prose without punctuation an excellent depiction of the construction of one of these cultural centers. This is a passage from the novel Gli Invisibili, the unseen in English. So Balestrini writes, within just a few days, there was a kind of convergence of people. All the dispersed people of the movement began to pour in all kinds, turned up workers, students, unemployed people, women, dropouts, old people, comrades from the extra parliamentary groups, anarchists. It was a different place from the usual sort of center the groups had. It was a movement center, and since it was big, there was plenty of room there for all these differences. These autonomous social centers also served as bases for political education and provided first experiences with collective self-governance. Autonomy at this point clearly referred not just to labor politics, but also to experimentation with new ways of living separate from or in the interstices of the dominant society. Also characteristic of the area of autonomia, along with other far-left groups, were various practices of mass illegality. One such practice, autoriduzione, self-reduction of prices, really, aimed at protesting and rectifying the excessive cost of living. Activists organized paying a collective determined political price for rent, food, electric bills, transportation. For example, after the cost of transport tickets in Turin was raised by 30% in 1 month in 1974, militants set up table to sell alternate tickets at the old price. Similarly, after electricity rates had gone up, self-reduction committees issued alternate electric bills at 50% discount. A second practice of mass illegality was proletarian shopping, spesa proletaria. Two representative examples, just among many, one could say, just to give you an idea. One on a day, and this is October 1974, so still in the middle of the decade, a group of workers, unemployed people, students, and other proletarians expropriated 2 supermarkets in Milan, inviting all other shoppers to join them and not paying. And in December 1976, 60 families in Rome participated together in a proletarian shopping spree at the Standa supermarket. Housing occupations constituted the third practice of mass illegality to address proletarian poverty. In Rome alone, in the early 1970s, over 3,000 apartments were illegally occupied. Here's another explanation from Lucio Castellano. He wrote, appropriation became part of a collective practice in all aspects of metropolitan life. Free or political shopping, occupation of buildings for open activities, the serene habit of young people not paying for movies and concerts, the refusal of overtime and the extension of coffee breaks in the factories. Above all, it was the appropriation of free time, liberation from the constraints of factory command, and the search for a new community. That was still all Lucio Castellano. These practices were certainly not viewed by activists as theft or looting. They were merely collective reappropriations of some of what had been taken away. So I think this is my last bit of this section. To many observers in more traditional political groups, the organizational project of autonomia was destined to fail for at least 2 reasons. First, to those for whom the industrial working class remains the ineluctable anchor of progressive politics, the heterogeneous subjectivities mobilized by autonomia appeared as something like the lumpen proletariat, chaotic, morally suspect, politically dangerous. Second, to those dedicated to vanguard's party structures, these experiments in decentralized and network organization could only appear as hopelessly incoherent. Luigi Bobbio, again, I mentioned before, he was an activist in Lotta Continua. Although he admired how autonomia attempted in the mid-1970s to follow the directions of the movement, following the movement, as I had said, was a practice that Lotta Continua had always taken pride in. But he criticized autonomia for having failed to complement this, following the movement, with a unifying organizational structure. Relying on the movement, he said, without attempting to interpret and govern it, as the area of autonomia does, means abandoning oneself to the 1,000 rivulets that compose it. It's certainly true that autonomia did not successfully articulate its diverse components into a coherent movement or develop a powerful and lasting organizational structure. Although activists in autonomia frequently cited the need for connections among the struggles of industrial workers, feminists, gay and lesbian activists, students, and many others, I keep saying, the organizational mechanisms and structures remained at best informal or implicit. The relative poverty of these links is highlighted by a comparison with the organizational projects of articulation that created strategic multiplicities in some other countries, particularly among feminists in the US. That'd be another thing I could talk about later if you're interested about the correspondence between these. Because I'm interested in the way that both in terms of race and gender, especially in the US, there were more successful projects of this kinds of articulation that were attempted within the area of autonomia. Crucial in these cases, I argue, and necessary for articulation, is a theoretical reasoning that recognizes the interwoven and mutually constitutive nature of various structures of power, with no priority among them, and correspondingly arrives at the political decision to refuse granting priority to any liberation struggle over others, allowing for the constitution of strategic multiplicities as a new form of struggle. That's what seems to me required, something that autonomia didn't succeed in. The widespread recognition among activists in autonomia at the end of this, the widespread recognition among activists in autonomia of the end of the centrality of the industrial worker as the protagonist of struggle, beginning in the mid-1970s, prepared the terrain for such an operation of articulation, even though it was not accomplished. The failure of autonomia to organize its vision of political multiplicity was certainly due in part to its own weaknesses and even internal developments. On one hand, many components within autonomia did not provide space for different groups. Oh, and they did, I'm sorry. Many of them did. I'll get to the not in a minute. This is Bifo, Franco Berardi writing. He said, the storm that the feminist movement provoked in male-female relations and the subsequent explosion of homosexual collectives thus territory in autonomia in which to consolidate and in which to transform the customs of living, sleeping, eating, smoking. I like the last part. On the other hand, however, many male activists, even those who expressed support for feminist movements and their role in the area of autonomia, were unable or unwilling at the time to abandon their antagonism or simply their indifference to the demands of feminists and gay activists. What was needed was a process of political education to overcome these obstacles, but that was cut short by external factors, notably, on the one side, the waves of state repression, and on the other, the political threats posed by the clandestine armed groups, such as the Red Brigades. If there's time, yeah, I guess I will. I hope there's time. Anyway, I will analyze the attempt by a segment of autonomy to deploy a dual strategy and construct a double organization in order to allow for development of democratic social and political projects while being able to defend against increasingly militarized state repression. Even such attempts, however, could not ultimately resist the repressive onslaught. Having been defeated, however, is not the only or most significant criterion for evaluation. It's worth heeding in this regard a phrase by Robin Kelly it's in the book called Race Rebels in the introductory chapter. Robin Kelly says, rather than success or failure, we should evaluate movements based on the power of their vision. In my view, this might amount to the same thing. The important criterion is whether a movement is able to discern an essential political problem. In the case of autonomia, one such problem was how to articulate together a constellation of movements and thus organize a lasting and politically effective multiplicity. In order to understand how autonomia discerned that problem and managed to gather together some of the prerequisites necessary for solving it, it's helpful to look back at the progression among the three acts above. One significant accomplishment was to recognize after the end of the first act, which I mentioned, say, right at the very beginning of the 1970s, the inadequacy of a political and theoretical perspective centered on the industrial working class. Moreover, this shift was interpreted within autonomia, as I said, not as a sign of a final exhaustion of class struggle or a farewell to the working class, but rather as a mandate to investigate the nature of new class composition, defined by its internal heterogeneity. Another key accomplishment was to grasp a second axis of heterogeneity. Not only is the proletariat internally diverse, but also it is joined by other struggles against different structures of domination, such as heteropatriarchy. Above, I tried to explain how these first two elements were expressed and consolidated by the revised meanings of autonomy and refusal of work. Finally, a third achievement was, having rejected the centralized structures of traditional and vanguard parties, to imagine and set in motion, albeit incompletely, a new organizational structure. The task of this new structure, alluded to with terms such as area, network, galaxy, constellation, was to articulate together these heterogeneous subjectivities and struggles, including a range of workers, waged, unwaged, precarious, and unemployed, together with feminists, gay and liberation activists, students, and others. All of this allowed autonomia to formulate a problem of political multiplicity, or what Sandro Mezzadra calls the puzzle of relationship between the heterogeneity of subjects in struggle and the necessary unity of action. A fully realized multiplicity would have to establish, on one hand, the relative autonomy and equal participation of each of these components, and on the other, it would have to articulate these components together so as to form a lasting structure capable of contesting successfully the ruling order. Autonomia never arrived at this goal, but individuating the problem clearly is itself one of the most significant treasures that the movements of the 70s bequeathed us. So here's my hesitation. Okay, I have 5 more minutes about this. I'm gonna go on. I haven't read any objections in you so far, so I'm gonna. So the second part, this is a separate part really in trying to recognize another way of seeing elements of armed struggle that was going on in the 1970s and the context of violence in general. Okay. All the political developments of the 1970s that I've mentioned so far took place against the backdrop of extreme fear, tension, and violence. The decisions made by the movements, the obstacles they faced, how their aims were distorted and the causes of their defeat cannot be understood without situating them in that atmosphere. For many radical Italian activists in the 70s, like for the Black Panthers in the US, violence versus nonviolence was not the primary debate. Instead, the more pressing issue was to decide what kind of force to deploy and how best to organize it. To understand this attitude, one has to appreciate the intensity of violence that activists had to confront. In the late 1960s and early 70s, social and revolutionary movements in Italy, as in many other countries, were battered by increasing waves of repression from the police and the state, at times in league with fascist groups. Violence, sometimes deadly, against protests and strikes, disinformation campaigns, layoffs of activist workers, provocations and entrapment, targeted assassinations of leaders, preventive detention, illegal arrest, and much more. The Italian government, or elements within it, conducted a so-called strategy of tension that fostered political violence on the left and the right in order to create a chaotic situation that would subsequently justify police and state repression and command. Italian activists, along with activists in many other countries, recognized that protest alone was no longer effective, and that, faced with such violence and repression, revolutionary movements required strategic innovations. Some activists, of course, chose to withstand the repression passive as best they could, or to retire from activism altogether, but many developed strategies of self-defense and eventually armed combat in various forms. The militarization of the movements was much criticized and hotly debated at the time, but by the second half of the decade, Italy was in a state of low-intensity civil war, punctuated with flashes of high intensity. The repression came first, and to give some indication of it, let me focus on a single event, which most of you know well, which quickly became iconic and charged with political significance. On the 12th of December 1969, a bomb planted at a bank at Piazza Fontana in Milan killed 17 and injured 88. The developments after the attack seemed like a Hollywood movie script, but one surely to be rejected by producers for being too absurd. Later on the same day of the bombing, police arrested and accused two well-known anarchists, Pietro Valpreda and Giuseppe Pinelli, despite the fact, which many remarked at the time, that such a deadly bombing was completely outside the repertoire practices of the anarchists and other far-left groups. Anarchists had a tradition of exploding small bombs at symbolic locations where they could guarantee no one would be injured. The Piazza Fontana bombing instead was designed to create mass casualties. 3 days after the explosion, the Milan police reported that one of the arrested anarchists, Pinelli, had died in custody, claiming quite implausibly that he committed suicide by jumping out of the fourth-story window of the police station. Gradually, over the course of months and years, what those on the left suspected immediately was confirmed. The arrested anarchists had nothing to do with the bombing, and the police were directly responsible for Pinelli's death. But more alarming evidence emerged too. Fascist activists were in fact the perpetrators of the bombing, and they had been aided in its planning and realization by elements of the police and the Secret Service, with connections going all the way to top government officials. Details remain murky to this day, as they often do in such cases, but the broad, firmed outlines of the event are enough to be shocking. An event, at least for people outside of Italy, I don't know, for me, an attack planned and carried out through the collaboration of police, state fascist forces, designed falsely to inculpate leftist activists, resulted directly and intentionally in scores of dead and injured as collateral damage. This was the first in a series of 1970s political attacks that came to be called state massacres, stragi di Stato, conducted with almost complete impunity. Lotta Continua, the party, one of the parties I mentioned earlier, launched immediately after the bombing an extensive public campaign to denounce the real perpetrators of the Piazza Fontana attack and its aftermath, highlighting the culpability and complicity of the police and the state. The campaign was a defining project for the party and gained great admiration from others on the left. Lotta Continua mobilized to make certain that the bombing and Pinelli's death were not covered up or silenced. In particular, the party led a sustained denunciation of the Milan police officer, Luigi Calabresi, who was not only responsible for Pinelli's interrogation, but also in previous years had led police surveillance and investigations of leftist activism. It came to light later that Calabresi had indeed, prior to Piazza Fontana, entrapped, falsely accused, and imprisoned other anarchists for smaller bombings. In other words, the Piazza Fontana bombing was a rehearsed police strategy. One might say in retrospect that the Piazza Fontana massacre, the violence and the impunity of the police and the state in collaboration with fascist groups, set the stage for the escalating and increasingly violent repression of the subsequent decade. Violence by police and factory security squads against demonstrations and strikers became more intense. There were repeated incidents of police firing weapons on and on several occasions killing demonstrators in the street. Fascist squads not only conducted small attacks against leftist demonstrations and social centers, but also carried out terrorist attacks that intentionally resulted in mass deaths, including some known ones, the 1974 bombing of an anti-fascist demonstration in Brescia, killing and wounding 102, the 1974 Italicus train bombing, 12 dead, 48 injured, and the 1980 Bologna train station bombing, 85 dead and over 200 wounded. There were even credible reports of the danger of a right-wing coup d'etat in Italy in the mid-1970s, which seemed even more plausible after the September 1973 coup in Chile. It remains unclear how close to those fears of coup came to reality, but it was certainly reasonable at the time to question, at the very least, whether Italy's not too distant fascist past was really past at all. In reaction to the escalating violence and repression, all the radical left movements felt the pressure to construct some means of self-defense. Factory workers were the first on the left to arm themselves. Organized workers used weapons not only to defend themselves against factory guards and police, but also to carry out sabotage in the factory, and increasingly as the decade went on, to conduct reprisals against guards, foremen, bosses guilty of abuse. At the massive 73 Fiat strike that I mentioned earlier, workers defended the occupied factory with arms, and the surrounding years in other factories too, armed workers' cells were formed. The Italian radical workers were not alone in this regard. Elsewhere, in other parts of this research, I'm talking about armed self-defense in US auto workers, in Germany too. There was this, okay, I can skip that part. By the mid-1970s, most of the major Italian movements recognized the need for self-defense and employed force in some way. Every worker or student demonstration, of course, at least since the late 1960s, organized a security team, Servizio d'Ordine, to protect demonstrators and if attacked by police or fascists to respond in self-defense, often with sticks or metal bars. In the course of the 70s, especially in the years when police shot and killed an increasing number of demonstrators, guns were deployed in the movements at demonstrations. In Autonomia, as in other groups, a military wing to manage the needs of self-defense developed in parallel to the political structures that I analyzed earlier. The network of relatively independent collectives focused on different structures of oppression, including waged and unwaged, precarious and unpaid work, feminist scale, etc. So this a military wing developed in parallel to, right, these political structures. In practice, however, the military and political wings of Autonomia were, in some respects, not as separate as this depiction makes it seem. Autonomia's mass deployment of violence at demonstration in the 70s intersected with its mass practices of illegality that I mentioned earlier, including housing occupations, self-reduction movements, the organization of proletarian shopping, etc. Autonomia's armed structures and practices shared to some extent the plural, decentralized nature of its political organization. That said, however, all political formations, including those of Autonomia, are necessarily shaped by pressures towards central control for obvious reasons. First, the acquisition and deployment of arms, as well as planning for military operations, have to maintain secrecy in the interest of protection from legal prosecution. Second, some sort of oversight is required to assure that activists acting independently don't conduct armed actions that are irresponsible and politically counterproductive. Finally, some structure of coordination is required to guarantee that armed actions will be politically effective. Even though Autonomia's military structures echoed some aspects of its political organization then, there were significant disjunctions between its democratic inclusive efforts in the political sphere and the demands of effectiveness and discipline in the military. Indeed, the ways in which activists in Autonomia and the broader left criticized the militarization of the movements, for its distraction from the political work, its distortion of political organization, its masculinist bravura, etc., is indicative of the difficulties of bridging the gap between these two modes of organization. The two modes of organization, the political one in a regime of multiplicity, let's say, and the need for this organization of force, defense. Autonomia's experiment in double organization, however, was not allowed much time to develop. A new and dramatically intensified wave of repression in the second half of the 70s defeated the revolutionary movements in Italy, including Autonomia. Non-terrorist movements were targeted by the state together with terrorist organizations differently. Special laws were passed that gave police and prosecutors expanded powers, allowing preventive detention of political activists for extended periods without charging them, imprisonment for years without coming to trial, highly irregular legal charges, and conviction on the basis of dubious testimony of those turned state's evidence, despite the protestations of Amnesty International and other human rights organizations. A network of special political prisons was constructed to house the activists and to keep them separate from the criminal prison population. Patrick Cunningham, someone I mentioned earlier, claims that this was the largest roundup of political activists in Western Europe since 1945. Balestrini and Moroni give these figures: 40,000 activists charged with crimes, 15,000 arrested, 4,000 convicted to short and long sentences, and thousands of others fled into exile. Although the numbers of dead, tortured, and imprisoned in Italy didn't reach the level of some other countries, such as Argentina, Chile, or Turkey, each country's repressive history contains its own unique horrors. The repression in Italy put an end to the long period of revolutionary activity and experimentation that culminated in the 70s. Despite the travails of civil war, however, these activists were able to hold together for a time a dual strategy to keep alive their democratic political projects. Let me just say one more word about that, and then I have two words to end. Just that if you're trying to imagine this outside of an Italian context, I tried comparing it to the same operation conducted by the Black Panthers. Essentially, the Black Panthers too had a social political project. Think of the breakfast program, the free clinics, etc. And they also had a self-defense program. And the two wings of the Panthers, which were often in tension, were trying to pursue this, what I'm calling a dual strategy, a double organization, in order to be able to conduct self-defense while still conducting a democratic political project. At the outset, I claimed that activists and movements collectively produce concepts, and one of the concepts I've highlighted here is multiplicity, I guess autonomy too. I want now to suggest another method for reading the movements, or rather a slightly different angle on the conceptual approach that highlights political problems. Many philosophers insist that the core task of philosophy is to distinguish between poorly posed and well-posed problems. Louis Althusser said, this is a lovely quote, I think. He says, "Nothing takes longer to solve than a problem that doesn't exist or has been poorly posed." In contrast, a well-posed problem already in some sense contains the conditions of its own solution. A central task of political theory then, including the theory done collectively in movements, is to cast aside problems that do not exist or poorly conceived ones and to formulate real ones clearly. So I want to end by posing one such problem. It's become cliche to say that the 70s was an age of fracture that unleashed forces that continue today to undermine the unity of the left. From the beginning of the decade, demands arose from within the movements to recognize and examine difference, division, and hierarchy, with frequent calls for separation. As the lines of fracture proliferated, the story goes, especially through developments of identity politics and new social movements, the left became riven with internal divisions. It was falling apart, destroying itself, squandering the effectiveness it once had. In general, advocates of unity were not so much defending a vision of the left as homogeneous, but rather they conceived the heterogeneity of actors and demands as being previously contained under the hegemony of one central protagonist, as for instance the industrial working class in the account I just mentioned earlier. For many others, of course, overthrowing the hierarchies of both the old and new left was by the 1970s long overdue, and to exit an oppressive unity, separatism for them appeared a necessary path. Many 1970s movements, however, recognized that both unity and separatism led to dead ends. They were poorly posed problems. As I elaborated earlier, in Italy, as elsewhere, multiplicity became key to the analysis of power and to the strategy of struggles. On the one hand, multiple structures of domination were recognized as relatively autonomous and yet interwoven and mutually constitutive, without one holding priority over others. In the 1970s, that set of power often included capital, patriarchy, white supremacy, imperialism, and nationalism. But the content of that list is open and depends on political education of the movement, that is, which forms of domination they have been able to recognize. Correspondingly, and maybe more importantly for what I tried to present here, activists saw that multiple movements for liberation must remain relatively autonomous and yet discover the means to articulate together a common struggle without priority among them. The real political problem that emerged was thus not unity or separation. That is a poorly posed problem. The real problem instead is articulation. Note that the analytical recognition that multiple structures of domination are interwoven, although an important basis, doesn't lead automatically to the articulation of struggles. That requires political work. One particularly difficult challenge facing the strategies of articulation, is to maintain the lack of priority among the struggles, even while recognizing real differences among the structure of domination, historically and in the present, and diverse pressures on each movement. It's easy to recognize the inspiration to multiplicity. It's easy to recognize the aspiration to multiplicity among today's most powerful and inspiring social movements. I can have much more to say about these in a minute, but here's just some examples. Black Lives Matter, for instance, was born in opposition to white supremacy and anti-black violence, but at every demonstration, that opposition is combined with affirmations of a feminist and anti-capitalist program, along with the celebration of black trans lives. For the Ni Una Menos movement in Argentina, that has moved throughout Latin America, similarly, although it emerged to combat femicide and patriarchal oppression, the battle against coloniality, racism, transphobia, and capitalist domination are central to its agenda. Likewise, labor organizing efforts today, from the great union confederations to the smallest picket of striking Starbucks workers, always proclaims their agenda in terms of feminist, trans, queer, decolonial, anti-ableist, and anti-racist demands. Now, if each of these movements were to maintain one struggle as primary, anti-racist, feminist, or anti-capitalist, respectively, while attempting to link other struggles in a secondary way, no real articulation would be possible, and understandably, activists long engaged in those other struggles would be wary or dismissive of such efforts. Required instead is a strategic effort to create solidarity and a form of struggle in common without priority, even though, of course, in daily experience, the movements are confronted by real difference. Experiments in Italy in the 70s, I'm saying we're pointing at exactly this problem. I'm not saying that the movements discovered a solution. Their efforts demonstrate instead that confronting the problem of strategic articulations among struggles, which emerged from the 70s, remains today one of the unavoidable challenges that all progressive and revolutionary movements must face. Thanks for your patience. That's good. So I think, if I understand correctly, we have to speak into microphones. Is that right? Vincenzo?
Yes, and there should be microphone.
Which means I have to stay here, and you could, okay, good.
Yeah.
Can I just say a word of thank you?
Yeah.
Is that on?
Yeah.
No, thank you very much, Michael. That was incredibly lucid and moving, I think, to hear that reconstruction of the 70s in Italy. I think we only have about 15 minutes left. Is that right? We need to close at 8. So
I apologize.
I will. No, it's fine. I will be very brief, but I wanted maybe to kick this off by just opening up a question about this notion of laboratory Italy. It seems to me that you gave very clearly an account of how the autonomia was kind of on the brink of being sort of movement of articulation, of different kinds of struggle. There'd been the critique by the feminists of Lotta Continua in 1976. As you moved on, was the beginnings of a kind of attempt to have a kind of coalition recognizing these separate struggles. I'm perhaps slightly less optimistic about how that was in the 70s. I think there were serious rifts between, for instance, sort of gay and lesbian activists and the more traditional activists coming from the left.
Workers'
Yeah, I don't think that was ever really articulated. But, you know, I think you're right to say there was this movement towards a kind of a recognition that there are multiple struggles. And I guess we don't know that what would have happened if there hadn't been this repression. I mean, these leaders, as you said, were all arrested in 1978, 79 after Moro. Of course, Antonio Negri, your co-writer, was one of the people who was arrested and clamped down. So this, you know, it's impossible to know what would have happened if there hadn't been the repression. What I find very kind of poignant is the fact that if we look at Italy now, none of this laboratory has carried over. I mean, the examples you gave of Black Lives Matter or Argentina, you know, or other places you could mention, are places where there's kind of struggles, grassroots struggles that seem to pick up some idea of intersectional connections between different movements. If you look at Italy now with the recent election, you know, with the sort of decimation of what remained of the left, with the fact that, you know, Italy, even the centri sociali, these places of activism, are in metropolitan centres, but the majority of the Italian population lives outside metropolitan centres, and most of them have voted for the right, this coalition of the right. So I suppose my question to kick this off is not to say, which is impossible to say, what would have happened if there hadn't been the repression at the end of the 70s, but how do you understand the viability of this laboratory Italy in other parts of the world? I think we shouldn't speak about Italy because I think it's too depressing to talk about what might be happening there now. But I think, you know, this might have germinated some kind of model of activism in other parts of the world. How would you address that? And maybe having said that, we can open this up for discussion and questions from the audience.
Sure, I'll be super brief. I mean, I think that there are two things about, like, reading the 1970s. Like, for one thing, a number of friends of mine, and many of them who were, you know, protagonists of the 1970s, are like, you know, why do you want to recount that, Michael? It was a big defeat. The communist tradition is full of defeats, it's not that a defeat is always an end. And it's also not that it always is taken up again in the same area, that without a certain kind of linear thing. So I guess I would say that what I'm finding, and this is that there's a kind of continuity among these same problems that I'm posing here with respect to Italy that I also am finding in the US or in Chile or in other parts of the world in the revolutionary movements of the 1970s that were posing, they were recognizing the same problems that I think we're facing today, and that in some respects, in some respects they presented the embryo or something, like we can see what has developed from them. In some respects, I think they were further ahead than we are today. And so I think there's a utility in recognizing what happened then. I mean, it doesn't have to be for those in Italy. It could be elsewhere of some of the strategies and possibilities that animated the movements then as, I was going to say as lessons for today, but I don't quite mean it exactly that way. But perhaps some amount of inspiration of recognizing the possibilities of confronting these difficulties. And yeah, I think it's mostly that. I mean, I'm also find myself inspired by by recognizing, like I said, the continuity among different national spaces. Like I had been, you know, like I said before, I grew up in the U.S. and was at a certain point quite inspired by what I learned then had gone on in Italy in the 70s. But sticking with only Italy would be somewhat limiting or depressing. So I guess in recognizing the continuities among other revolutionary movements of the time is, I think, a more maybe enriching perspective, and one that allows it not just end there. I mean, you're totally right with your first comment too. I mean, and I said like briefly that many in the movements in the late 1970s were not able I would say lacking a certain political education in order to be able to transform from what they had been thinking of as a industrial worker-centered movement to something that had to get beyond that. But that political education is a matter of time too, to move from that. Yeah, I too, I don't know what to say about how to trace these things to Italy now, but also I would have the same question in Chile or in Portugal about what was inspiring in the 70s and comparing it to now. Right. I mean, there certainly hasn't been a linear process.
I wanted to ask you a question
Please.
from
Yeah.
a slightly different angle about the
Yeah.
period between the the mid-70s and now.
Yeah.
That has to do with symbolic sites of struggle.
Yeah.
And something you've written about elsewhere earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking back to Turin and not Mirafiori, but the Lingotto
Mm-hmm.
will become a shopping mall just a few years later, and a shopping mall that is designed by Renzo Piano, and we're kind of invited to consume an older model of production, right? And then right next door to it will be the center of slow food, right? Which is another, you didn't mention ecology is another of those fracturing movements, but it is. And I just wondered if you could talk about those as symbolic features of, it's almost like labor had to parasitize rather than just negate, But anyway, I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about the specific Turin problem of symbolically dealing with labor after the dispersal of Lingotto and
No, you're doing
Fiat.
that better than I could, but that's good. That's really good. I mean, I think the one thing I do think is really, and maybe this is the way I should have responded first with, that I find really valuable, and I was trying to emphasize, is I think this movement away from, both the intensity of the focus on the protagonist of the industrial worker and the focus on industrial production as the leadership of any revolutionary imagination, to be able to move away from that, even to the extent that these movements were able to in the course of the 1970s, I think is super important. And one that without, like I said, bidding farewell to the working class or even thinking of an end to the class struggle, but reconfiguring what class means, thinking about a new composition of labor, and then also it's tentatively or in fits and starts, maybe trying to link it to other movements, seems to me a very important advance. So in a way, instead of responding to you, I'm really responding to you. I'm one step behind. But you're great at that. That's a beautiful example. And you're right that adding ecological movements like for today, but also starting in the 70s, that's another thing that we see beginning there that was difficult also for these movements to add, but eventually did. That would be great. We have somebody. Yeah. Thanks.
Does this work? Yes.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about this notion of the coincidence with the problems of the 70s and
Yeah.
whether this also might include some kind of nonlinear development or transformation, also if there are contradictions, so that, there's very much an emphasis on the idea of multiplicity, but I think in some movements today that we could perhaps trace to movements in the 70s or even our reactions to those movements.
Yeah.
Like I'm thinking about like in Iran right now,
Yes.
or I'm thinking about in Chile. Some of those actually require the focus on a specific contradiction in order to actually carry, the revolutionary movement or the social movement. And so the insistence on a kind of neutrality of the subject or a multiplicity might end up then being actually counter to the movement. So also thinking about like Portugal in which, in the 1970s, the kind of like transformative promise of solidarity with, colonized countries, that sort of transformative idea of like, like in the Portuguese state, there's this kind of idea a racial democracy now, and like that's the kind of state idea of the revolution, but that's actually very repressive towards minority people in Portugal, and then there's recent murders of people in Portugal, like migrants in Portugal by the state. So I'm wondering how you square this kind of need to actually acknowledge the specificity of the contradiction and the kind of like change that has happened with this more neutral idea of a multiplicity. I was also thinking about social reproduction as a concept because, the family has changed so much in its structure, and now social reproduction is so often taken on by people outside of the family, by service workers. So actually, a lot of it is racialized, or more racialized even than it was in the 70s. So, sorry, that's a very broad.
Let me get straight to the thing. Do you mean that even when talking about a multiplicity of struggles, one has to recognize at certain moments, maybe conjuncturally, a certain contradiction that is more important than thinking about this multiplicity? That could be okay.
Yeah, or some of those contradictions might become vanguard contradictions, as it were, without that being because of a priority, but actually being because of the conjuncture.
Yes,
in which
I think I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah. So
let me try, I think I have a brief explanation that might work. And so let me give it's an example again from Ni Una Menos in Argentina. So just because they understand their assemblies to be functioning as a way of, like I said, they started as a movement against femicide and against gender violence, but then became also a movement about labor and indigenous rights and trans rights, et cetera. But in their assemblies, each day or each meeting, there is one group that often takes priority. Like, I don't know, a trans person was killed in the city that day. And so it's not that they're struggling, so normally they think we keep equally, we're struggling against, we're anti-capitalist, we're anti-patriarchy, but one day we have to all unite against transphobia. So it's not, and it's not as if therefore everyone else is abandoning their struggles and we're no longer anti-capitalists. It's just that there are certain, is this the way I was understanding the contradiction part? But maybe I'm misunderstanding you. At certain points you have to, even in constructing a strategy of multiplicity in the way I'm describing it, one has to organize based on the contradictions one's facing. Okay, I feel like we are going to have to continue this because I think I didn't quite get that.
Anybody?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I had a question whether in your review of the history of that period, particularly with autonomia, if there was any suggestion that, and this might just be some history that I personally don't know, but other than the repression, the overt state repression, whether there was kind of infiltration, because I sometimes feel like the fractures of the 70s were fomented as a kind of ideological warfare against, as like a Cold War effort to limit the efficacy of those efforts. Like, I'm thinking of the spy cops thing. I don't know if you're following that in England, where the police had, infiltrated all these left-wing groups over an extended period of time on a, minute-by-minute reporting basis over decades,
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there was a counterinsurgency playbook that worked out in all these countries, and it's no coincidence that they were very similar. So, we know much more about the FBI's infiltration of the Black liberation movements and others in incredibly detailed and insidious ways. And I think that was certainly part those kinds of infiltration or provocations also, as a way of discrediting the movements was part of all of these. I don't know the details of the infiltration networks in Italy. It sounds like the British ones better. Yeah. I think that was, I mean, I think there was a whole repertoire of elements of repression, and I guess maybe just the reason I insisted on reading that part is to, in some ways, it's, I think it's sometimes in the memory of this period, it's forgotten the extent of the forms and severity, like not only of the overt violence of, you know, these state massacres, but also the detailed ways like that you're pointing to that were also equally destructive. It may be even more so, maybe even more so, yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thanks for that. It was a really beautiful account of the physiognomy of those years that I always, even if I study it, I always forget kind of the internecine kind of changes. Mm-hmm. My question is, it's largely painted in your account and elsewhere as kind of a domestic story of autochthonous kind of growth across time. And I was really wondering, like, how for you in your account of this, I was struck by your phrase portability of practices. What practices are actually being imported from elsewhere? Because, you know, it's always kind of, Tronti kind of starts this wave, right? And it kind of, that's how the drama kind of plays out, all these different areas. But I'm wondering what you think is actually coming from abroad into Italy that they're kind of using. I mean, obvious references about culture of, you know, Woodstock and that type of things that you see at like Parco Lambro and Nudo, but I'm thinking about like just more actual kind of, forms of political practice that you see coming from elsewhere.
There's a lot, and that's interesting. And in some of the, you know, in some ways, I felt the need, even in other parts of this book, that I felt the need to give a national account because it seemed to be the only way to give an introduction to it. But as important as that is the kind of travel that you're talking about. Yeah, so like two examples that occur to me that might be just indicative that are useful was there was representatives from the League of Revolutionary Black Workers that toured in northern Italy, and that so the relationship to Detroit, let's say, and their which had a material contact. That's what I mean. It wasn't just like they were reading about it, because they certainly were reading about it, but also the material contact. And then I was thinking how Lotto Continua had rented a house in Lisbon during the revolution and had people go there as a kind of reporting back thing. So I mean, I think there were a certain amount of circulation. Not from, you know, less from, in Potere Operaio, at least as far as I understand, there was a bit of a, much less than in Lotta Continua, you know, they had a kind of slogan of not giving priority to third world liberation struggles. Like it was sort of like, because I think the rationale for it was, instead of just like everyone saying the revolution must be happening elsewhere, let's make it here. That was their way of saying it. But it meant that there wasn't the kind of circulation to Cuba or to other places in Potere Operaio that there was in Lotta Continua. But like I said, instead that circulation of radical industrial worker movements from Germany and France, certainly, I know of those examples. But it's the US ones that I find more interesting, and then of course there were all kinds of in theoretical and in literature and translation projects that did that. But those material ones are ones that seem that might be most interesting to go down that route. Yeah.
I'm really sorry we have a cut-off
Yes.
time, but I really would like to thank you very much again for that.
Yeah.
And, thanks all for coming.